Here we have the wedge tenons that have been drying overnight, so I've unclamped them. And now what we need to do is cut off the excess. So what I'm going to use here is called a flush cut saw, and there's text imprinted on one side of the blade that I'm pointing to now that you can't really read. What it says is this side up. So the way flush cut saws work is their teeth only bend one way. They bend towards the side that says this side up. What that means is if you hold it against your final workpiece and then you saw back and forth like I'm doing, it's not going to leave teeth marks in the edge of your material. It's going to make a nice flush cut. Again, this is because the teeth only bend in one direction. That's technically called the set of the teeth. On most saws, the set is measured by the distance between the teeth that alternate bending left and right. The reason for having a set is to prevent binding. So your average crosscut saw is going to have a relatively wide set because after you're starting to get into the material, if there's no set, that means your teeth are the exact same width as the blade, and it's going to bind up on you. So this saw does have a chance to bind because the set's all in one direction, but it makes very nice clean cuts. This first cut I did without a clamp, and I ended up nicking my finger. So for all the other cuts, I went out and I grabbed just a simple spring clamp and I clamped it down to the table. What this does is make sure that the material doesn't move. It's one less thing I have to worry about. I don't have to worry about holding the material down as well. So I can just focus on keeping the blade against the side of the workpiece and cutting in a nice straight line. Anytime you can take out one kind of factor like that, it's worth taking the time to do. Alright, so this is one of the teak pieces that was cut. As you can see, I've gone through with the flush cut saw. Those darker areas that you see on either side of the tenon, those are bits of epoxy that need to be cleaned up. So almost all, if not all of these, still need some work after they're cut. They're going to need to be sanded. And in spots, I might need to go in with a chisel to remove some of the epoxy. But what this does is it can quickly allow me to get the material as close as possible to the side of the leg without risking cutting into the leg. You don't want to leave a ton of material for the tenons because the grain that you're seeing is end grain. End grain is very hard to sand. That's why a lot of high-end cutting boards are known as end grain cutting boards. You basically flip all the pieces so their ends are showing, because it's a very resilient grain, and it's softer on knives, but it takes a lot of work to sand it down. So what I'm showing you here, this is another area where epoxy has leaked out. It's just something I'm going to have to clean up. There's epoxy in almost all of the joints. It's an inevitable part of gluing something up. whenever you glue something up, you want to put enough glue and pressure in there so that epoxy squeezes out. It's how you know that it's a sufficient, it's going to be a strong joint. Here, after I've cut everything out with the flush cut saw, I'm going in with 100 grit sandpaper on a sanding block, and I'm just giving everything a pretty quick once over, trying to remove all the epoxy that I can, make sure that the wedge tenon is flush with the leg. If it's sticking out, it's not going to have that perfect crisp look. So you really want to make sure everything is flush. After you're done sanding, you give it a feel with your finger, make sure there's no edges that are higher or lower than any other part. And then after all this is done, I'll go through with 120 and quickly sand everything again to make a final pass. But again, here you're looking to make sure you get rid of all the high points, you get rid of all of the epoxy, and you leave it with a nice smooth finish. All right, this one that I'm showing you, this is again one of the teak ones. So here's the epoxy above my fingers where I just touched. That's one of the areas that the shaper kind of ripped a piece off. There's not much I can do about that. That shows the importance of needing to get really close with the bandsaw before going to the shaper. I think that was the first one that I ran as a test piece to see how close I needed to get. So you kind of learn as you go. But I'm going to continue sanding, making sure everything is good, and then the next step will be getting out a chisel and showing you what I'm doing with that. So a quick note on the epoxy that's squeezed out or been left out on the sides of the material. The reason you have to get rid of it is it's not going to allow any of your finish to either bond or seep into the actual material. If you just leave it there, it's going to have ridges, it's going to have discoloration when compared to the rest of it, again, because it prevents any finish from bonding in that area. So you guys might have noticed that when you were staining your Keyrex, any place that you had glue, the stain didn't seep in, the finish didn't hold properly. So that's really the important part about getting all the epoxy out. So this step, what I'm showing you here is on the inside of the joint, some of the squeeze out of the epoxy. Like I said earlier, squeeze out, not only is it inevitable, you want to see squeeze out. So this is a kind of cleanup that you basically want to have because it'll tell you used enough glue, there was enough pressure on the joint. So notice that I'm clamping the material down. Again, you want to make sure this piece is not moving. I'm going to be going in here with a chisel. Chisels are very sharp and easy to hurt yourself with. You want to make sure you're never using the chisel towards your body. So you'll notice I move around as I'm doing this, depending on the direction that I'm using the chisel. For this purpose, I'm not using a mallet, I'm not striking it, I'm just pushing lightly against the epoxy and basically chipping it off a little bit at a time. If you go really hard or if you smack it with a mallet, two things are going to happen. One, that clamp is not going to hold. You need to secure it much more securely. Two, you're going to start gouging out large chunks of material from your project. The goal here is just to remove the little bits of epoxy. So in my hand, you'll see that's all the epoxy that came off. So you're not taking a lot off. You just need to get the chisel in there, and it'll literally start popping it off as you work the chisel behind it. So this is what the seam now looks like of that joint. So I'm going to go through and do that for every single joint, because again, no finish will adhere here, and you'll have this nasty bubbled out epoxy otherwise that's a different color than everything else. So if you skip this step, your joints won't be weaker. Some people might not notice it, but when you do notice it, it's going to stick out like a sore thumb. This doesn't take that long. Probably took me 20 minutes to a half hour to do all of these joints. And again, it doesn't take much force. You just got to slowly work your way into it and little bit at a time chip away at the epoxy.